Thank you, sir. Dr. Singh.
First of all, let me join my senior panelists, co-panelists here in thanking you, Dakshinamurthy, and your team of the Federal Premium to invite me to become part of this discussion. Where is this conflict going is the first question all of us are trying to understand. Wars, as an academic, I see can move in multiple directions. They could escalate or they could terminate, they could stalemate, they could move into, kickstarts of a fatigue kind of up, on and on again, off again. My broad guess would be that at this stage, completing 1 year, where you're seeing lots of discussions are happening on what have we learned and where it is going, I want to say that it is perhaps going towards escalation of the multiple possibilities that we can notice, and that is clearly visible from multiple things that are happening around us. For example, yesterday and today, General Assembly is debating on one more resolution on Ukraine, and on Friday there is a ministerial meeting of UN Security Council. But if you have followed how UN organs have addressed these issues, it's only divisiveness that has come forth. And indeed, we have understood that as long as there is at least one party to conflict which holds a veto power, UN has shown virtually, inability or become dysfunctional in this case. Now, that clearly leaves the onus on major powers to, find a way out outside United Nations. And what are these major powers doing? We again heard two very interesting speeches on Tuesday morning and Tuesday evening, one in Moscow, other is in Warsaw. And you heard both sides trying to ratchet up rather than, sort of calm down and cool down the kind of enrage that we notice on the ground. President Putin, once again alluded to nuclear threat. He's decided to suspend the New START treaty that was signed for another 5 years in 2001, and indeed also said that his side is completely ready for one or many more nuclear tests in case United States does similar things. But we also understand that this grandstanding or brandishing of nuclear threats at such high frequency actually erodes the credibility of that threat over a period of time. And how the other side is responding is also equally grandstanding posturing that we notice, among several other things, of calling him an autocrat, and he's now facing the strong American willpower and so on. Interesting revelation of President Biden's speech from Warsaw City was to say he has now clubbed together about 50 countries coalition that are going to supply weapons to Ukraine to continue standing against Russia. And of course, also the fact that they are now moving forward and planning to start supplying offensive weapons, main battle tanks to Ukraine. So in that sense, it doesn't look like moving towards termination or accommodation or even stalemate. I think it's clearly moving towards escalation. And that tells us how something that President Putin likes to say, when you have major powers deciding the trajectories and tenor of a conflict, the first thing, any local conflict becomes a global conflict immediately. So it's a tussle between two big powers that, we see decimation on the ground is no longer the focus. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions have moved out of Ukraine all over, and I have, lots of them in Vancouver where I speak from. So that becomes a secondary issue in that sense. And I think when you look at these leaders, both President Putin and Biden are going into their domestic general elections. So is actually Ukraine and indeed India as well. And sometimes these domestic, I think, compulsions again begin to impact upon how they wish to at least articulate. And many times some of these things become largely lip services and showcasing of their own individual personalities, focus on legacies. And that the main issue where the conflict begins to get marginalized over a period of time. So let me close by saying my initial comment would be that I think the conflict is not going to disappear in a hurry, is where I see conflict going. But what I see increasingly happening is that the epic center of the conflict and the misery of people there is over a period of time going to become less central to global debates than I think the geopolitics of major powers.
Because I feel that danger is somewhere there in the back of the mind. I feel that
Yes,
in the
indeed.
past, yeah, Mr.
Indeed.
Swaz, Dr. Singh, yeah.
Thank you. I'm so delighted that Ambassador Bhatia chose to ask me a question. It's an honor to me to try to respond to him. Two things. One, why I said I see escalation rather than termination. I put that in binary mode, that it's not moving towards termination, it is moving towards escalation. And why I said so is simply because the whole West uniting now to begin supplying uh, counter-strike or offensive weapons, not just defense technologies, defensive technologies. And to main battle tanks, I heard Ambassador Sikri adding even aircraft, fighter aircraft. I'm sure she has a good, sort of access to knowledge in terms of from where that indication is becoming a possibility. So, yes, in that sense, it's going to move towards escalation. I am aware of the fact that initial great strides that Russia had made, that has shrunk over a period of time as much as by half, as I'm told. So yes, Russia's initial grand plans of, in November itself, launching a draft treaty asking United States and NATO to give written security guarantees and sending a former President Viktor to Belarus to, reach Kiev, and they are going to change Zelensky and he's going to take over in a matter of 2 weeks. That is no longer happening. So where President Putin has now, over time of, over period of time has compromised, is now focusing on 4 regions that in September 30th, accession treaties he signed with these 4 representatives from there. He says these 4 regions belong to me now. So that, of course, is definitely true. But to answer your second and more important question about nuclear escalation, and there is no confusion on that, because if you read the speech given on Tuesday, State of the Nation speech by President Putin, 2 hour long speech, he has answered this question himself, that nuclear threat is not aimed at Ukraine. He's clearly said that. So that clearly means that is aimed at containing NATO, and it has worked. NATO has ensured that they do not get to be seen as getting into the conflict directly themselves. Now, what is adding to that thread? Again, I mentioned earlier losing credibility because of repeated mentions. This Monday, again, Russia had tested one nuclear capable MIRV actually missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, which actually the test failed. And now that would otherwise would have matched with President Biden's visit to Kiev, but it kind of boomeranged. So both in terms of articulation of nuclear threat is not aimed at Ukraine, and of course this failure of the ballistic missile test is an indication that I don't think need to look at that seriously. But I know if you look at madman theory, yes, the only worst case scenario is tactical nuclear weapon in eastern part of the Dnipro River. And those are weapons built in 1950s and 60s. Nobody was making after that. And those are rudimentary weapons. And I think response to that from West will continue to be still conventional, because my contention again is that this is emerging to be now an issue for major powers geopolitics, where Ukraine is nothing but a battlefield to satisfy their egos.
Yeah.
As to this question of India, ma'am has spoken a bit about it. But really, if you look at India and its foreign policy, India has managed to straddle both Russia and the US sides, quite successfully. So procuring oil from Russia and then reselling it to Europe. But within this, what I see is that there is also an element of let go by the West because it's also convenient for them, because they are also getting oil from somewhere. Because there is the real issue is, if you really clamp down on Russian oil, it's going to be really tough. So this way, there is a kind of a leak, a known leak, an accepted leak that happens, and India is benefiting from it. It's more a de facto benefit rather than an aggressive or a conscious recognition of India's power in the world. I mean, so how do you react to this, Dr. Singh?
That question is to me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think India has used Ukraine war in converting a challenge into an opportunity, I would say. And this has become a kind of a case of India, becoming far more assertive in pursuing its own national interest and showcasing that it has perspectives that are not necessarily in line with the major powers. So whether it is United States or Russia, both of them are slightly uncomfortable with what India is saying. And India has pursued what I call proactive neutrality in the conflict, which works at two levels: constantly engaging at the apex level with the national leaders to ensure that the damage can be mitigated. They come to the talking table and somehow the ceasefire is signed, but not waiting until these actors begin to connect with each other, supplying humanitarian assistance irrespective of the shape and size and tenor of the speeches from both sides. So that has put India in a very different light around the world, and really some kind of acceptance and now recognition of India's perspective on Ukraine. And same applies to even neighboring Afghanistan, again, where India has continuously supplied humanitarian assistance while not recognizing the Taliban government or accepting the way things are running in Kabul. So that kind of has brought in a new chapter, I would say, or at least an inflection point in India's foreign policy, and has raised India's stature. It is coincident that India this year is also chairing the G20 and SCO summits. Now, G20 is world's most powerful, sort of body right now. 6 of the 9 nuclear weapon powers, top 15 defense spenders are there. Of course, the top 20 economies are all there. And of course, the huge emerging India and China sitting there together. That, of course, will also be a challenge for India to make sure that all of them can come together. As Ambassador Bhatia was mentioning before the discussion began, Lavrov is coming for the foreign ministers meeting. We don't know if President Putin will be coming for the summit meeting and what that means for other leaders joining. And so India has major stakes in bringing some kind of respite in Ukraine. And final very quick point, as an academic, I think there is also then not just India, but increasing space for what is now begin to be called emerging economies or middle powers. And now these are all getting clubbed together, whether it is Turkey or it is Iran or India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. They all are reflecting some kind of broad bandwidth of their understanding of how to engage with Ukraine conflict. And they are not towing the line of either Russia or United States. Now, Turkey has already shown us that it can, really influence Russia, and at some stage, grain from Ukraine had started going out with understanding that those ships will not be attacked. And thanks to Turkey, Turkey has been more active in that. India's prime ministers, that one phrase that Ambassador Sikri mentioned, this era is not era of war. At least half a dozen global leaders have repeated that phrase in their speeches. This was part of the Bali summit's final declaration. And that again, brings in certain focus on what India can do in terms of resolving this conflict. So I think there is an opportunity here for India. And I think not me and many others have said that the Ukraine conflict would be an opportunity for India.
I would put the same question to Dr. Singh a little differently. Is India acting from a position of strength or from a position of, necessity?
We are sitting with two very senior diplomats. Foreign policy is always a combination of leverages and limitations, and that's what diplomats do. They maximize their leverages and minimize the limitations through the communication paradigm and engagement bargaining. So definitely, yes, as Ambassador Sikri mentioned, there are several others who are underlining the potential. And I think German foreign minister was most recent in saying that, given the presidency of G20, maybe India has some leverages in looking at the Ukraine issue. I understand, like most nations, Indian leaders will be modest in saying that we have very limited leverages on that. As an academic, I can say, yes, there are limited leverages, what very high stakes now in ensuring some kind of thaw, some kind of pause button. Because minus that, I don't see a scenario where, as Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, having all the 19 other national leaders sitting around the table in New Delhi in September. That would be a huge challenge. And to make that as a success, the stakes that India has now in ensuring some kind of, some kind of, I don't know what to say, that we all agreed this conflict is not going away very quickly. Now, whether that will be a pause or a thaw or a temporary lowering down of tempers or simple fatigue on both sides, that will make it possible to de-escalate violence at least briefly during that period. Uh, Something has to be done. So let me just conclude by saying yes, limited leverages, but increasingly high stakes in ensuring some kind of mitigation so that India can have a fantastic, successful G20 summit.
Thank you.